What do Dr. Dre and the richest banking family in history have in common? Incestuous business practices. Law 23 reads, concentrate your forces, conserve your forces and energies by keeping them concentrated at their strongest point. You gain more by finding a rich mine and mining it deeper than by flitting from one shallow mine to another. Intensity defeats extensity every time. When looking for sources of power to elevate you, find the one key patron, the fat cow who will give you milk for a long time to come. The Rothschild family of bankers and financiers have become the ire of many conspiracy theories and some facts in the modern era. But they started off in a tight-knit Jewish neighborhood in Frankfurt, Germany. They were very concentrated and they were self-reliant, almost never mingling outside of their own, and intent on preserving their culture and beliefs. Mayer Amschel was the first of their family to gain wealth in the late 18th century from lending money and understood how powerful being so tight-knit was. Mayer Amschel had allied himself with one family, the Princes of Thurn und Taxis. He made himself these princes' primary banker as opposed to trying to get many clients. He also trusted nobody who was an outsider of his community in the business, only employing his children and close relatives. The closer the family was, the stronger they would become, and in no time, 5 of Mayer Amschel's sons were running his business. And when he passed away in 1812, he did another thing out of the norm. He didn't name a primary heir. He decided to set up all of his sons to continue the family business, so they would stay united and would resist infiltration by outsiders into their business. While in control of the business, they knew that to grow their wealth, they would need to expand into the entirety of Europe, as opposed to being tied to any single country or prince. So one of the brothers moved to London, England, one to Paris, France, one stayed in Frankfurt, Germany, one moved to Vienna, Austria, and the youngest went to Naples, Italy. They could use this spread to concentrate their control on Europe's financial market. The problem with this is that a widespread network would open them up to the danger their father warned them about: division. And in order to combat that, what did they decide to do? Becoming the most powerful group in European finance and politics by excluding outsiders. They would have the fastest courier system in Europe, which let them get news of events ahead of any competitor, a monopoly on information with that level of speed. And all of their communication was written in Frankfurt Yiddish, a language that only they could understand. It was worthless to even steal because the only people that could translate it were on the same team as the Rothschilds. What about marriage though? That was a problem, because if they married outside, they would leave themselves open to other families understanding what was going on in their business, who could potentially betray them. Simple solution: incest. James Rothschild would marry his brother Solomon's, that went to Italy's daughter. They couldn't be happier, and this became the new family policy. A couple of years later, Nathan, the brother in London, married his daughter to Solomon's son, which was cousins, not the technical definition of incest, as it was with the first marriage being niece and uncle. But in the following years, 5 brothers would put together 18 marriages amongst their children, 16 of which were with first cousins. Many rich families of that time suffered and lost their wealth in the first half of the 19th century, but the Rothschilds persisted and grew their wealth during that time, still rich even until today. Without any literal incest involved, Death Row Records was co-founded by Dr. Dre and Suge Knight as the forefront, with 2 other founders who were less popular. They grew to massive popularity by focusing on a few key artists. The Chronic, released in 1992, brought Snoop Dogg into the game, amongst others like the Dog Pound. But in the spirit of keeping it in the family, this leverage was used to propel Snoop Dogg into his own solo career on Death Row with the album Doggy Style in 1993, who was then leveraged to release Dog Food in 1995, Corrupt and Daz Dillinger's album as The Dog Pound, which is not what they were referred to when they were features on The Chronic, but it made sense for the brand, and it was also a #1 album. Following that up with Tupac in 1996 releasing his album All Eyes on Me, Dr. Dre would soon depart the record label that same year, and it's important to note his philosophy of keeping the troops concentrated. At the time, Death Row even moved like a militia, always together, traveling together, recording together. But there were several members of Death Row that never got to release an album at all, and definitely not while Dr. Dre was still there. The DOC, who was a founder of Death Row in part, never released an album due to an accident he had. Michelle never released an album on Death Row during Dre's tenure despite appearing multiple times on Death Row songs. Nate Dogg, RBX, Danny Boy, and Lady of Rage are some of the others who wouldn't release at all, and if one of them did, it was after Dr. Dre had departed. So Dre, as a label owner, was responsible for 3 unique artists who all had #1 albums: Snoop Dogg, The Dogg Pound, and Tupac. The third one would be himself, which didn't go #1, but 3 of these 4 albums would be considered classics. Not bad. But after starting his own label, Aftermath Records, in that same year, things wouldn't change. Dr. Dre employed the same exact method of concentrating his forces, with the record label operating for 28 years now, and only 8 unique artists ever releasing an album on the record label. Also giving him the title of the most successful hip-hop record label of all time if we consider batting average. Because if we look at a list of how many artists released more than 1 album on Aftermath, the number drops to 4. Eminem, 50 Cent, Kendrick Lamar, and Anderson .Paak. Talk about concentrating your forces. Eminem was the first original new rapper that Dre brought onto the team. The Firm released their project, The Album, in 1997, which went #1, but that was a group composed by Nas, who was already a successful rapper that was signed to a separate label. He just brought his group to Aftermath. But with keeping it in the family, after Eminem's Slim Shady LP became a huge success, Dr. Dre would release 2001, featuring Eminem and others. Follow up with 2 more #1 Eminem albums in 2000 and 2002, with Marshall Mathers LP and The Eminem Show. So in the span of 3 years, other than Dr. Dre, Eminem was the only artist that released. It's important to note because everyone would have wanted to sign to Aftermath at the time, but quality control was in place. And also Rothschild-esque recruitment, because the next signing to Aftermath would be none other than 50 Cent, who was brought on through Eminem's Shady Records, and then The Game, that was brought in by 50 Cent via G-Unit. Busta Rhymes would have 1 album, The Big Bang, that went #1, and Truth Hurts released an album in 2002 that charted at #5, but that wasn't hip-hop, it was R&B, which is not what we're focusing on here. There wouldn't be another new release by a new rapper until 2012, with Kendrick Lamar, that was discovered by Dr. Dre this time. Dr. Dre would pick up Anderson .Paak and start collaborating with him, eventually putting him on his 2015 album Compton, but he wouldn't put anything out via Aftermath until 2018 with his project Oxnard, and then everything after being on Aftermath as well. And in 2023, Easy Mill was signed via Shady through Eminem, but he's not dropped an album yet. None of these artists have missed, commercially either. Anderson .Paak was criminally underrated for a while, but with Silk Sonic, which that album is under Aftermath as well as Atlantic, he finally got his commercial success with a #1 record. Kendrick Lamar, #1s. The documentary by The Game, classic and #1. Eminem, too many #1s to count. 50 Cent, #1s. And Busta Rhymes' only album on Aftermath, a #1. But he didn't always hit on artists. Dr. Dre has signed plenty of rappers to Aftermath. Just some of the names: Stat Quo, The Last Emperor, Eve, Justice being one of the more recent, Bishop Lamont, Joel Ortiz for a bit, John Connor, and many, many others who have never dropped a single project on Aftermath. It's not just a testament to Dr. Dre's taste-making, but his hands-on involvement with everyone that he's working with at any given moment. While there have been many signees coming in and out of Aftermath, they weren't all there at once. And while they were there, Dre was constantly working with them. And if he didn't feel it was up to par to release, or to position them as his next big star, he would abandon the project. Sometimes they would end up shelved, but a lot of them were dropped when they requested it. Dr. Dre took the opposite approach to a record label like Def Jam or many others who, when they had 1 or 2 successes, decided to expand their army, signing tons of artists, some failing, some succeeding, but having a bloated roster that couldn't be tended to by the executives, and in this case, the executive producer and genius that is Dr. Dre. And that's partially why we've seen him able to knock it out of the park time and time again for well over 30 years, even after having to start from scratch with Aftermath, while Suge Knight got to keep the superstar roster Dre helped sign, build, and produce for. And why Suge Knight wasn't able to get a single other star to match up since then. With Aftermath, nobody ever really knows what's going on either. Barely anything ever leaks, and that's how close-knit things are, like the Rothschilds. People thought Dre was working on Detox for the better part of a decade before he just came out with Compton. Most of the Kendrick Lamar projects, nobody knew what was going to happen with Damn on a sound level. Nobody even knows what Justice recorded with Dr. Dre while he was there, or the plans they had before parting ways. The reversal reads, tying yourself to a single source of power has one preeminent danger. If that person dies, leaves, or falls from grace, you suffer. In our case, this doesn't really apply. If an artist that is massively successful dies, in the case of Juice WRLD or XXX, their catalog multiplies in streams and value over time. The artist can rarely leave if they have strong contractual obligations, and if they fall from grace, it doesn't mean that their previous catalog is no longer valuable. Besides that, by the time they fall out of grace, an individual like Dre would have found someone or been brought someone by that particular artist who would be next up. And that's the important thing to keep in mind. A lot of executives get lost in the business and lose their ear to what's new, outsourcing that to A&Rs or other employees. But Dre was, has been, and always will be someone who is keeping himself close and listening to the developing sounds that are going on right now. What is hot, what's not, without losing his identity. The perfect example of that was Anderson .Paak, who in the mid-2010s sounded nothing like what Dr. Dre worked with before. But it was a sound and style that was modern and something that Dre, with his skill and identity, could see represent his branded vision. And it made sense. Tons of record labels sign people who are hot, can generate money, and sometimes can make good music too. But that isn't enough for Dre and even his protege Eminem too. If you see Shady Records, that roster has been and continues to be a taste profile of Eminem. And that's not something a lot of record label owners consider as they grow. And it might mean they make less money, but for them, the trade-off is beyond worth it. Other labels with broad rosters have a mix of different sounds. Jay-Z being a great example of that in the more modern day with Roc Nation. Even Rockefeller had far less longevity in their artists than Aftermath did, but with Roc Nation, artists like Vic Mensa, Jaden Smith, Willow, J. Cole, and Belly, just a couple of names, the entire spectrum of sound, and that's not including the singers signed to there too. But they're operating more as a massive business without concentrated forces anymore. And when you tell anybody about Roc Nation Records, not Roc Nation Management, which has people like Meg and Lil Uzi Vert, a lot of people will give you a blank stare and are unable to name even one artist signed. Because they haven't had any artists excel on a commercial level, minus J. Cole since he's been there since 2009, that can compete with other labels, or even a record label identity for that matter. But looking at the reversal, it does keep Roc Nation safe, profitable, and likely to exist for a much longer time. After all, the record labels that have lasted the longest have all left a particular genre and have signed and distributed everything from pop, rock, hip-hop, country, EDM, techno, and likely now even Latin. It is the smart business move, and it's really out of the norm that a near hip-hop only record label like Aftermath can not only exist, but flourish for almost 30 years.